Welcome to Whispers of History, where forgotten tales, strange events, and mysterious moments from the past come alive. One whisper at a time. Subscribe, relax, and let the past whisper you to sleep. Our story begins thousands of years ago, in the heart of the earliest civilizations. Imagine the river valleys of Mesopotamia, where reeds swayed gently in the breeze, and scribes etched signs onto wet clay. Among records of trade and laws, there were also texts, rare, but remarkable, that spoke of affection, desire, and the union of man and woman. The instructions of Shurapak, one of the oldest surviving wisdom texts from around 2500 BCE, is not a manual of passion in the way we think today, but it carries fragments of familial and social advice, words on loyalty, respect, and the roles that held households together. These beginnings reveal a truth, that love and marriage were never left entirely to chance. They were guided, taught, and shaped by tradition. As we move into Egypt, the landscape shifts. Papyrus scrolls, lighter, smoother, easier to hold than clay, carried poems and reflections about companionship. In texts like the love songs of the New Kingdom, one hears voices of longing, a young woman speaking of her beloved as the river that quenches her thirst, or a man describing the sweetness of his lover's presence. These were not strict manuals, but they offered guidance nonetheless, to see love as both tender and sustaining, as something woven into daily life like the flowing Nile. It is gentle to imagine how these words were read. Perhaps by candlelight, perhaps softly recited, or perhaps shared as quiet lessons from one generation to the next. Other ancient texts were far more explicit. In India, around 400 BCE, there emerged early forms of writing that would eventually inspire the Kama Sutra. Though often misunderstood today, these works were not mere catalogues of physical techniques. They were broad manuals, balancing the duties of marriage with the pleasures of intimacy. They taught not just touch, but also conversation, companionship, and the art of emotional connection. One can almost hear the calm rhythm of such texts being recited in a shaded courtyard, while the monsoon rains whispered against stone walls. They were guides not only for bodies but for hearts, an acknowledgement that love requires both discipline and play. These manuals of love were not entirely about joy. Many contained rules, restrictions, and reminders of duty. In China, the Book of Rites and later texts spoke of proper conduct between husband and wife, weaving marriage into the structure of harmony and filial duty. Love was not to disrupt order, but to fit within it. Even here, in the quiet lines of philosophy, we find attempts to teach intimacy, though restrained and disciplined. Yet, if you pause for a moment, you may sense how even these rules carried whispers of care, instructions on how to live not alone, but together. Through these first manuals, scattered across cultures, we see an emerging pattern. Humans, regardless of time or place, wanted guidance. They sought reassurance that love could be understood, that marriage could be prepared for, and that the union of two lives was not left to uncertainty. The texts varied, some poetic, some strict, some celebratory, some cautious. But all carried the same underlying truth, that love was both a mystery and a craft. To write about it was to try, gently, to tame its unpredictability. Think now of the people who touched these words. A young bride-to-be, tracing symbols on papyrus with nervous fingers. A groom listening to his father recite wisdom about loyalty and patience. A scholar carefully copying a passage, knowing it may outlast him by centuries. These were not abstract voices, they were lives, pulsing with quiet hope, bound by traditions yet still seeking tenderness. And as you breathe slowly, you might sense how similar they are to us. The nervousness before union. The longing to understand how best to love. The curiosity about how others, in faraway lands and long ago times, navigated the same questions. In this gentle beginning, we also find contradictions. Manuals spoke of passion, yet often warned against too much indulgence. They celebrated intimacy, yet enforced roles and hierarchies. They encouraged unity, yet sometimes treated marriage more as contract than companionship. These dualities reveal the complexity of human love, never fully free, yet never fully bound. It is soothing to linger here for a while, in the contradictions, for they remind us that love has always been both fragile and enduring. Manuals could guide, but not control. They could describe, but not replace the living heartbeat of affection. As these manuals spread through cultures, they began to blend instruction with poetry. The lines between advice and art grew thin. One could read of duty and obedience, and in the next line, encounter a verse of longing or devotion. This merging reminds us that love, even when disciplined by rules, always escapes into expression. We can think of these manuals as both maps and mirrors. Maps, because they gave directions on how to live together. Mirrors, because they reflected the anxieties and dreams of their time. To drift through these texts is to drift through humanity's first recorded attempts to steady the heart. They were whispered beginnings, tentative but persistent. And though we may smile at their restrictions or marvel at their poetry, they remind us of something timeless, that love has always been a lesson, always a path learned slowly, always both fragile and enduring. As the clay hardened, as the papyrus rolled, as the palm leaves dried, people left us these tender artifacts of guidance. They are the earliest voices in a long and endless conversation about love and marriage. And so, as we close this first chapter of our journey, you may find yourself calmer, slower, more attuned to the quiet truth these manuals whisper, that to love is to learn, to marry is to shape a bond, and to seek guidance is to admit that the heart, while powerful, is also tender and uncertain. In the next part of our journey, we will step gently from these whispered beginnings into the structured world of marriage as contract, where love was often placed after duty, and unions were sealed with law before desire. But for now, rest with this thought: the first manuals did not command, they whispered. And in their whispers, the human longing for connection still drifts across time. If the earliest manuals whispered of love as longing and companionship, the next chapter of history turns to a quieter, heavier tone. Here, marriage was no longer only about emotion or intimacy. It became a structure, a contract binding families, property, and inheritance together. In many early societies, the union between two people was not considered a private affair. It was a social arrangement, often negotiated by elders or community leaders. The manuals and guides that emerged in this period reflect this shift. They spoke less about the beating heart and more about obligations, roles, and the balance of power within a household. Imagine, for example, ancient Babylon. The Code of Hammurabi, inscribed around 1750 BCE, stands tall as one of history's earliest collections of laws. Among its hundreds of clauses are precise details about marriage contracts, dowries, and the consequences of neglect or betrayal. To marry was not just to fall in love. It was to enter into a binding agreement that preserved lineage, secured wealth, and honored tradition. These laws may feel distant, but their purpose was simple: to ensure stability in uncertain times. Crops might fail, kingdoms might rise and fall, but a marriage contract tied families together in mutual responsibility. Love, if it grew, was a gift. But duty came first. The manuals of this era often spoke to men and women separately. To husbands, they offered guidance on managing property, leading households, and protecting family honor. To wives, they gave instructions on obedience, chastity, and loyalty. While this may feel restrictive to us today, it reflected a world where marriage was as much about survival as affection. In Egypt, contracts written on papyrus spelled out what a husband promised to provide and what a wife contributed in return. The language was careful, structured, deliberate. These agreements did not leave room for passion, but they ensured fairness, or at least clarity. Imagine two families gathered as the contract was read aloud, each word carrying weight like the stone walls of a temple. When we drift into ancient Greece, the picture grows more complex. Manuals and laws there often defined marriage as a civic duty. A man was expected to marry not for personal desire, but for the continuation of the family line and the stability of the city-state. Philosophers like Aristotle even wrote about the purpose of union. Blending reason with practicality, yet alongside this structured view, there existed poetry, like the verses of Sappho, reminding us that the human heart does not always bend to duty. Manuals gave the rules, poets whispered the exceptions. China, too, offers us a picture of marriage as contract. Confucian teachings emphasized harmony between husband and wife as part of the greater harmony of family and society. Here, manuals described roles carefully, the husband as head, the wife as supportive partner. But there were also passages, subtle and quiet, reminding couples to act with kindness, for respect was as essential as obedience. Such guidance reveals something profound, even in strict systems. There was recognition that partnership could not be sustained by duty alone. Compassion, though rarely emphasized, was always present as a shadow behind the rules. To think of marriage in this way may feel distant, even cold. But if you pause, you may notice how this structure offered reassurance. In a world where life was uncertain, marriage contracts provided predictability. They promised care, even if not affection. They bound families together, offering stability against storms. And so, the manuals of this time were less like poetry and more like architecture. They built frameworks, walls and beams, within which daily life unfolded. Love, when it came, was like the gentle light through the windows, welcome, but not guaranteed. Consider the life of a young bride in ancient Rome. Manuals like those of Ovid, though playful in their advice, existed alongside strict legal expectations of marriage. For wealthy families, marriages were arranged to secure alliances. A woman might walk into a new home knowing little of her husband, her life tied to contracts negotiated in rooms she never entered, and yet, human beings are more than rules. Diaries, letters, and poems reveal tenderness growing within arranged unions. Love sometimes bloomed after duty, not before. These manuals, then, are best understood not as cages but as frameworks within which individuals carved their own stories. Marriage as contract shaped not only personal lives but entire societies. Through it, land passed from father to son, alliances were secured, and kingdoms stabilized. The manuals that described these processes were not written to inspire passion, but to ensure continuity, and yet, there is a kind of calmness in this. These guides remind us that love, for much of history, was seen as too fragile to stand alone. It needed scaffolding, dowries, agreements, rituals, to survive the winds of time. Still, alongside these legalistic texts, smaller voices emerge. A letter from a husband to his wife in Roman Egypt speaks not of duty but of longing, reminding us that behind every contract lived a pulse of human emotion. Manuals may have emphasized duty before desire, but desire was never silent. It is soothing to realize this balance. Law provided the structure, but affection often filled the space within it. Without the structure, unions might falter. Without affection, they might crumble. Manuals tried to capture both, but leaned toward the security of duty. As we drift toward the close of this segment, imagine yourself holding one of these contracts. The ink is faded, the papyrus brittle. The words speak of property, lineage, and duty. Yet in the spaces between lines, you sense something else, the quiet heartbeat of lives that hoped for more than obligation. marriage's contract may seem far from love as we imagine it. Yet, it is part of the same story. It shows us how humanity sought to anchor love in a world that often felt unstable. Manuals here were not whispers of longing but assurances of continuity. And in their calm, steady language, they carried a promise that two lives, joined not only by desire but by duty, could endure. And now, as we prepare to move gently into the next chapter, let the thought linger: love is fragile, yet societies try to anchor it with law. In the next segment, we will explore how manuals merged law with faith, weaving not only duty but also the divine into the fabric of marriage. As we move further into the history of love and marriage, a new presence enters the manuals and teachings: the voice of the sacred. Where earlier guides spoke of contracts, lineage, and survival, many cultures soon placed marriage under the watchful eyes of the gods. Religion transformed marriage from a social contract into something deeper, something cosmic. It was no longer simply about two families joined in agreement. It became a union blessed, judged, and shaped by divine order. And in the manuals of this period, we see the intertwining of the sacred and the profane, the holy and the earthly, shaping how couples were expected to love, desire, and live together. In ancient India, this blending of love and the sacred was especially profound. The Vedic hymns and later Hindu texts described marriage as a sacrament, a sacred bond woven into Dharma, the cosmic order. Manuals like the Griya Sutras gave precise rituals: how to light the sacred fire, how to circle it together, how to recite vows that promised not only loyalty but also spiritual unity. Here, love was not only between two people. It was a thread in the vast fabric of the universe. Manuals reminded couples that their union echoed the balance of gods and goddesses, of sun and moon, of earth and sky. In Jewish tradition, the ketubah, a marriage contract, was both legal and sacred. Written in Aramaic or Hebrew, it described the husband's responsibilities to his wife. Yet its presence in religious ceremony transformed it into more than law. It became a visible covenant before God. The manuals of rabbis and scholars guided not only how the ketubah was written, but how couples were to live faithfully and kindly within it. This blending of law, love, and faith illustrates a deep truth. In many cultures, marriage was seen as too important to leave to human choice alone. It required divine blessing, divine oversight, divine meaning. Christianity, too, framed marriage within sacred texts. The Bible speaks of union as two becoming one flesh, and by the medieval period, manuals for priests and confessional guides gave instructions on how couples should approach marriage, intimacy, and fidelity. Marriage became a sacrament, a holy act of grace, not merely a human arrangement. Yet the manuals here could be stern. They cautioned against lust, prescribed times when intimacy was forbidden, and defined the purpose of marriage largely in terms of procreation. Still, beneath the rules, one finds passages that describe tenderness, patience, and sacrificial love. In Islam, manuals and religious texts also wove love with sacred duty. Marriage was honored as half of faith, a partnership blessed by Allah. Texts such as hadith collections and fiqh manuals offered both spiritual and practical guidance: how a husband should provide with kindness, how a wife should be respected, how intimacy itself could be an act of devotion when framed by mutual care. Here, the sacred was not meant to suppress affection but to dignify it, to give daily tenderness a place within divine purpose. Across cultures, what is striking is how manuals began to teach that love was never just private. It had cosmic significance. A kiss, a vow, a shared meal, each could reflect the harmony of heaven and earth. But this came with tension. Manuals often drew lines: which desires were holy, which were sinful, which moments were sacred, which profane. For example, Christian manuals of the Middle Ages often warned couples against excessive pleasure. To love too much, they cautioned, was to risk idolatry. Love must be balanced, tempered, guided. Yet in the Song of Songs, preserved in the Bible, we find an unabashed celebration of longing, beauty, and passion, reminding us that even within the sacred, the earthly could not be silenced. This duality, the sacred and the profane, reveals the deep complexity of how humans understood love. Manuals could not simply banish desire, they had to find ways to channel it. So they sanctified it, framed it within ritual, and gave it meaning. Love became both duty and devotion, both contract and sacrament. And yet, these manuals also carried tenderness. Instructions for husbands to treat wives gently. Guidance for wives to be respected in return. Passages reminding both that kindness was as holy as ritual. As we pause in this segment, imagine yourself in one of these ceremonies. The air is thick with incense. The priest or scholar reads softly from a manuscript. Families stand in silence, listening. Two hands join, two voices recite vows. The sacred and the earthly meet in this single moment, and manuals, scrolls, and prayers are there to guide it. The manuals of religion gave marriage a deeper frame, not only for survival, not only for law, but for eternity. And while they sometimes imposed restrictions, they also offered comfort. To love under divine gaze was to believe that one's union mattered in the vast, mysterious order of the universe. It is soothing to reflect on how these manuals, though centuries old, still shape how many view marriage today. The idea of vows before God, of love sanctified by ritual, of union as both personal and cosmic, these are legacies of sacred manuals written long ago. And so, as we step out of this segment, let us carry this thought: manuals of religion did not erase desire, nor did they ignore duty. Instead, they tried to hold them together, binding them with threads of the sacred. And now, as we drift gently forward, we leave behind the altars, the temples, and the ritual fires. In the next chapter, we will enter a quieter world, one of gestures, codes, and hidden signs. For beyond the sacred ceremonies, couples found other ways to express love: subtle movements, unspoken symbols, the quiet language of touch. As we leave behind the altars and sacred fires, we find ourselves stepping into a quieter, more intimate world. A world where manuals and teachings no longer speak only of contracts or rituals, but of subtler things, gestures, symbols, and the hidden language of affection. For love, though often restrained by law or shaped by faith, has always sought private pathways of expression. Manuals across time did not always focus on explicit acts or sacred duties. Some turned instead toward the unspoken, the small movements of a hand, the tilt of a head, the exchange of tokens, or the rhythm of silence between two people. These codes of love, though sometimes overlooked, remind us that human beings have always found ways to speak the heart without words. In classical Rome, Ovid's writings captured this language well. Though playful and often scandalous, his works acknowledged what manuals could not always say plainly: that love lives as much in subtlety as in passion. A brush of fingers at a banquet, a glance across the forum, a shared object passed from one to another, these became manuals in motion, lessons not written in ink but enacted in silence. Imagine the careful awareness of these moments. A lover's eyes lingering longer than expected. A ribbon tied not simply for fashion but as a quiet message. Manuals that touched on such symbols often taught readers to see more deeply, to notice the hidden signals of the heart. In China, 2 manuals spoke of symbolic gestures. The exchange of hairpins, the offering of embroidered handkerchiefs, the quiet presentation of calligraphy or poems, each carried meaning beyond its surface. A scholar might gift a brush painting of plum blossoms, knowing the recipient would understand its association with resilience and devotion. Manuals and cultural texts instructed lovers in these traditions, creating a language of affection through art, poetry, and symbolism. To imagine this as calming, two figures seated apart, a folded poem traveling silently between them, the words inside more intimate than a spoken confession could ever be. The medieval courts of Europe added another layer, chivalric codes and courtly gestures. Knights and troubadours, often inspired by manuals of etiquette and poetry, developed elaborate rituals of service and devotion. To wear a lady's token, a ribbon, a glove, or a pendant, was to proclaim loyalty and affection. Though these manuals sometimes cloaked love in formality, they created a safe space for desire to express itself within boundaries. Even the smallest acts, holding a gaze, kneeling in reverence, exchanging a symbolic gift, became charged with tenderness, but the manuals did not only celebrate noble gestures. In quieter households, everyday tokens carried meaning as well. A shared piece of fruit, a garment folded with care, or even a meal prepared with unusual tenderness could speak volumes. Manuals of domestic life sometimes reminded husbands and wives to look for such signs, the small acts that sustained affection over years. These lessons remind us that love is not always grand or dramatic. It often whispers through the ordinary. Manuals that guided these gestures served as reminders to see love in the details, a hand resting gently on a shoulder, or the simple act of listening without words. Across Asia and the Middle East, gesture manuals often blurred with poetry. A simple look could hold layers of meaning when captured in verse. A raised eyebrow, a hidden smile, a glance lowered in modesty, each became a form of communication. Manuals that translated such gestures for readers allowed them to understand what might otherwise have been overlooked. These manuals reveal an intriguing truth, that love often thrives not in what is shouted but in what is quietly exchanged. Silence itself becomes language, and stillness becomes signal. Even the act of touch itself became codified in manuals. The placement of a hand, on the shoulder, the waist, or the hand, was given meaning in some texts. These descriptions were not always sensual, but symbolic. To touch a hand could be a pledge. To rest a hand lightly on the back could be reassurance. To avoid touch at all could be a declaration of distance. Manuals gave guidance for when such gestures were appropriate, and when they were forbidden. Through this, couples learned to navigate the delicate boundary between expression and restraint. It is calming to linger on the idea that love can survive in silence. Manuals of this kind remind us that affection does not always need words, nor even acts of passion. It can be carried in the fold of a letter, in the pause before a smile, in the gift of a flower placed where it will be found. These hidden languages carried comfort. They allowed lovers to communicate in times when society or law restrained them. And they remind us, even now, that subtlety often speaks most deeply. In Japan, the Heian court elevated this to an art form. Manuals of etiquette instructed noble lovers on how to exchange poems written on folded paper, how to scent them with incense, and how to leave them in hidden places. These manuals described the art of writing, folding, and even the choice of paper, reminding us that love could be communicated through layers of detail, each choice carrying meaning. Imagine the quiet thrill of discovering such a folded note, its fragrance still clinging, its words whispered across time. Manuals that preserved these customs gave structure to an otherwise fleeting exchange, transforming it into ritualized intimacy. The language of touch and symbol also appears in religious manuals, though often quietly. Writings instructed couples on gestures of respect, a bow, a kiss on the forehead, a shared prayer. These were sacred codes of affection, meant to strengthen not just emotion but spiritual connection. Such gestures reveal how manuals blended the ordinary with the holy. To bow before one's partner, to offer a blessing, to light a candle together, these small rituals elevated daily affection into something timeless. as we near the close of this segment, let us pause and reflect. The manuals of hidden symbols did not command in loud voices. They whispered. They taught lovers to see beyond the obvious, to find meaning in the smallest acts, to read affection in gestures and silences. This is a soothing reminder for us even now. Love often thrives in details we overlook. A glance, a folded note, a shared token, each becomes a manual in its own way, teaching us how to love not with grandeur, but with gentleness. And so, we close this chapter. From the grandeur of temples to the intimacy of folded letters, we see how manuals turned attention to the subtleties of affection. They taught us that love can live not only in vows and contracts, but in the small, almost invisible exchanges between hearts. In our next step, we will move gently from gestures to the more explicit. We will explore manuals that spoke plainly of intimacy itself, the private instructions whispered between pages, guiding couples in the art of physical union. When we think of manuals of love and marriage, we might imagine advice about choosing a partner, arranging a household, or performing ritual duties. Yet hidden among these writings are texts that dared to whisper about the most private aspects of human life, the shared intimacy of the bedchamber. Though often veiled in metaphor, or disguised as medical guidance, these manuals sought to teach what was rarely spoken aloud, the art of physical union, and the ways in which desire might be both cultivated and restrained. Perhaps the most famous of these works is the Kama Sutra, written in India around the 3rd century CE. Far from being a mere catalogue of physical postures, the text was a sophisticated guide to the rhythms of desire, the harmonies of companionship, and the balance between restraint and indulgence. It reminded its readers that intimacy was not only a physical act, but also an art of timing, mood, and attention. The manual spoke of glances, words, and touches, the preludes that make intimacy more than mere instinct. Other cultures, too, produced guides that approached intimacy as both science and philosophy. In the Islamic Golden Age, medical texts written by scholars such as Al-Nafsawi offer detailed advice on intimacy, framed as health instruction. These works explain the balance of humors, the importance of moderation, and the belief that pleasure could bring both healing and harmony. Such manuals, though frank, were not salacious. They were calm, clinical, and often poetic, treating desire as one part of the human condition, to be understood rather than feared. In medieval Europe, however, intimacy manuals often wore disguises. Many were hidden within texts on medicine or morality. A manual might explain the workings of the body, offering guidance on fertility, pregnancy, or anatomy, while quietly slipping in advice about how couples should approach the marriage bed. Doctors wrote about the importance of affection for conception. Priests sometimes provided coded instructions about the timing of intimacy within marriage. Even when desire was viewed with suspicion, manuals could not avoid acknowledging it as part of life. The advice varied widely. Some manuals were gentle, encouraging tenderness and patience. Others were stern, warning against excess or indulgence. Together, they reveal a tension that still lingers today, the balance between desire as a natural joy, and desire as something that might slip into danger if uncontrolled. In the manuals, even posture and timing were discussed, sometimes in elaborate detail, sometimes only hinted at. Each culture framed these lessons in its own way, but the common thread was an acknowledgement that intimacy, like any other part of life, could be taught and learned. The presence of these manuals tells us something quiet but important. Human beings have always sought understanding, even in their most private moments. Instead of leaving intimacy to chance, they reached for guidance, reassurance, and structure. For some, the manuals provided a way to approach intimacy without fear. For others, they offered permission, a reminder that tenderness and pleasure were not sins but gifts. In China, the tradition of bedchamber arts combined intimacy with Taoist philosophy. Manuals described techniques that were said to harmonize energy, balance yin and yang, and promote long life. These writings were not only about physical union but about spiritual cultivation, the gentle breath, a shared rhythm, an alignment of energies. The manuals turned intimacy into meditation. The act was no longer only about two bodies, but about joining heaven and earth in miniature. While some manuals were pragmatic, others were poetic. Japanese texts, for example, often blended intimacy with aesthetics. A description of the body was compared to landscapes, rivers, and seasons. The joining of lovers was likened to the moon meeting the sea, or the breeze stirring cherry blossoms. Such imagery softened what might otherwise have seemed blunt. It allowed intimacy to be written of with dignity, beauty, and serenity. As we reflect on these writings, it is soothing to realize how different cultures found unique ways to balance openness with restraint. Some manuals were bold, describing positions and techniques. Others were quiet, focusing on mood and symbolism. Yet together, they remind us that intimacy has always been more than instinct. It is a craft, an art, a shared journey, but manuals also served a protective role. They warned against carelessness, against neglect, and against selfishness. They advised patience with one's partner, attention to comfort, and the cultivation of mutual trust. Some even recommended the use of perfumes, baths, and music to create a calming atmosphere. In these gentle reminders, we hear echoes of care, that intimacy was not only about desire but also about respect. When viewed with calm eyes, these manuals become less about novelty or indulgence, and more about guidance in living well with another. They are whispers from the past, reminding us that tenderness, patience, and awareness have always been essential, and perhaps, in reading them, one might even find comfort, the assurance that intimacy has always been a shared mystery, one that others before us also sought to understand. As we close this segment, we drift gently from the bedchamber to the broader household. For the manuals did not stop with intimacy alone. They also turned their gaze toward roles and expectations, particularly the place of women within marriage. In our next chapter, we will explore how manuals offered guidance, restraints, and sometimes even hidden encouragements, shaping the lives of wives across centuries. If the manuals of intimacy whispered in private, the manuals written for women often spoke more sternly, shaping expectations for the daily rhythm of marriage. Throughout history, these texts reveal not only how societies viewed women, but also how women navigated their place within love, marriage, and household life. They were at once guides, rules, and sometimes warnings. They taught women how to walk, speak, and serve. But hidden within their pages, we can sometimes glimpse quiet counsels of comfort, moments where encouragement, tenderness, and even subtle resistance appeared. In ancient Greece, advice for wives was simple, even stark: to remain silent, obedient, and devoted to household tasks. Manuals often described women as caretakers of the hearth, their lives revolving around weaving, cooking, and bearing children. Yet even in these severe lines, there were occasional acknowledgments of companionship, reminders that a husband should treat his wife with fairness, that affection was a bond as vital as duty. In Rome, household manuals written for men gave instructions on how to manage wives alongside servants and estates. Women were expected to embody modesty and discipline, to guard virtue, and to live quietly. Yet love letters, poems, and inscriptions reveal another side: Roman women who expressed wit, affection, and even longing. Manuals might have sought restraint, but the heart often moved in freer ways. As centuries passed, religious teachings further shaped women's roles. In Christian Europe, manuals and sermons often emphasized obedience, humility, and service. Wives were urged to see themselves as partners in devotion, but also as followers under the authority of husbands. The texts could be strict, painting submission as sacred duty. Yet alongside these rules, manuals sometimes urged men to treat their wives with kindness. The expectation of care softened the severity, even if gently. Within these contradictions lay the quiet struggle of women navigating between expectation and individuality. In the Islamic world, manuals often blended practical and spiritual advice. Wives were instructed in modesty, in creating harmony within the household, and in showing respect. Yet texts also acknowledged women's intelligence and role in guiding their families. Some manuals preserved poems written by women, offering counsel that showed wit, depth, and independence. This duality, restraint and voice, is a theme repeated across cultures. Manuals set limits, but women found ways to express themselves through writing, poetry, and subtle acts of defiance. In China, Confucian manuals such as the instructions for women set strict ideals. Women were to be obedient daughters, faithful wives, and dutiful mothers. They were told to be gentle in speech, humble in behavior, and patient in suffering. Yet within the same tradition, poetry by women flourished, and manuals sometimes recognized the quiet power of a wife in maintaining harmony and dignity. The Japanese Heian period offers another layer. Manuals of etiquette advised noblewomen in dress, speech, and correspondence. They were to embody grace and subtlety, expressing themselves through poetry, scent, and style. Here, restraint became its own art, a way of shaping beauty within boundaries. Even within constraint, women's creativity flourished. Their diaries and writings reveal voices that still echo with clarity across centuries. In medieval Europe, one of the most famous texts written for women was Le Ménagier de Paris, a 14th-century guidebook from a husband to his young wife. It included not only household advice but moral guidance, recipes, and even gentle words of care. Though framed within patriarchy, it shows that manuals could also be affectionate, attempts, however imperfect, at nurturing a partnership. What stands out across these traditions is the balance between control and compassion. Manuals often instructed women to be quiet, modest, and dutiful. Yet the very existence of these texts shows how central women were, not merely as passive companions, but as figures whose actions shaped families, households, and communities. There were also manuals that offered surprising encouragements. Some whispered to women to take care of their own health, to seek rest, and to guard against mistreatment. Others advised men not to be harsh, and to cherish their wives as companions. These were small but meaningful reminders that affection and respect were part of marriage as much as obedience. Beyond formal manuals, folklore carried guidance as well. Mothers passed down advice to daughters: how to read a husband's moods, how to protect one's dignity, how to find small spaces of freedom within constraint. These oral traditions were as much a manual as any written text, though less easily preserved. Even the harshest manuals reveal something tender when read slowly: the recognition that women were central to the household, that their influence shaped daily life, and that their well-being mattered. These texts may seem restrictive, yet they are also reminders of the countless women who lived, loved, and left their quiet marks on history. As we close this segment, let us carry with us both the weight and the resilience of these voices. Manuals sought to teach obedience, but women found ways to inscribe their own wisdom between the lines. Their presence remains felt, not only in rules, but in poems, letters, and the tender acts of care that survived outside of ink. As we drift onward, we leave behind the household expectations and step into a different kind of guidance. For in the next segment, manuals will no longer speak only of duties, but of romance itself. They will carry us into the world of knights, troubadours, and the ideals of courtly love. From the quiet chambers where women were taught obedience, we move outward into the grand halls of castles and the open fields of medieval Europe. Here, love was dressed in armor and cloaked in poetry. Manuals of this age began to speak of courtship, of service, and of the strange fusion of duty and desire we now call courtly love. The medieval world was filled with paradoxes. Marriage remained a practical arrangement, a contract between families, a bond of property and lineage. Yet alongside this formality grew a softer current, where love was sung in ballads, whispered in gardens, and enshrined in codes of behavior. Manuals of etiquette and romance did not ignore this current. Instead, they shaped it into rules, transforming longing into ritual. One of the earliest and most influential of these manuals was The Art of Courtly Love, written in the 12th century by Andreas Capellanus. This text attempted to codify the strange, almost paradoxical rules of noble affection. Love, according to these instructions, was both forbidden and exalted. It was meant to be pursued with devotion, yet restrained by honor. The manual described love as ennobling. It lifted the spirit, refined manners, and made a knight more virtuous. Yet it also acknowledged love's difficulties, secrecy, longing, and the pain of distance. To serve a lady was to enter a kind of apprenticeship in patience, humility, and devotion. Courtly love manuals taught gestures of service, bowing deeply, addressing women with reverence, carrying tokens of affection. A ribbon tied on an arm, a glove tucked into armor, a pendant worn on the chest, each was a symbol, a silent vow. Manuals explained how these tokens should be received, cherished, and displayed with dignity. In these teachings, love became a performance. Yet the performance carried sincerity. Knights and ladies followed these codes not only to impress, but also to create a shared language, one that gave structure to emotions often hidden beneath layers of duty. At court, troubadours sang verses that served as living manuals of love. Their ballads taught noble listeners how to long gracefully, how to praise beauty without crudeness, how to endure absence with dignity. These songs, passed from hall to hall, were as instructive as any written text. Love, according to this tradition, was a form of learning. A knight became more refined by loving. A lady became more honored by being loved. Manuals reinforced this idea, presenting love not as chaos, but as discipline, yet these codes were not without tension. Manuals often instructed that true courtly love could not exist within marriage. Marriage, after all, was a matter of property. Love, in contrast, was imagined as free, ennobling, and secret. Thus, manuals sometimes described an ideal where knights devoted themselves to ladies already bound in wedlock. This paradox reminds us that manuals were not simply practical guides. They were fantasies, attempts to reconcile human longing with social order. The codes of chivalry provided a safe stage for emotions that had no place in contracts. The rituals of chivalry also extended to tournaments. Manuals explained the etiquette of dedicating victories to a lady, of wearing her colors into battle, and of presenting spoils as gifts. In this way, martial skill became linked to romance. A knight's strength was measured not only by arms, but by the grace with which he served his chosen lady. These symbolic acts turned love into a form of public performance, while intimacy itself often remained hidden. But not all manuals celebrated chivalry without question. Some offered warnings about false love, deceit, or the dangers of misplaced devotion. They advised women to test a knight's sincerity, to guard against flattery, and to distinguish between lust and loyalty. In this way, manuals served not only men but also women, teaching them how to read intentions carefully. Courtly love, with its rituals of longing, found echoes far beyond the medieval castle. Manuals of romance influenced literature, theater, and even the slow unfolding of etiquette in later centuries. The language of bows, tokens, and vows continued long after tournaments had faded, shaping the very idea of romantic gesture. and yet, as beautiful as these ideals were, they rarely reflected the daily lives of most people. Common households had no knights, no troubadours, no courts of love. Their manuals spoke more plainly of marriage, work, and survival. Still, even here, echoes of courtly ideals trickled down, carried in songs, folk tales, and whispered advice. This mixture of high ritual and humble reality reminds us that manuals of love were not only rules, but aspirations, reflections of how people wished love could be. In reading these texts today, we find a kind of soothing rhythm. Courtly manuals may seem distant, filled with ornate rules and elaborate rituals, yet their core message feels familiar. To love is to serve. To cherish is to pay attention. To be devoted is to hold another in honor. As we close this segment, we can imagine the rustle of banners, the strum of a lute, the murmur of verses carried across candlelit halls. Manuals of chivalry sought to tame desire with ritual, to transform longing into discipline, and to remind lovers that even in restraint, devotion could shine brightly. And so, we drift onward. From the chivalric codes of devotion, we now turn to another great transformation. With the coming of the printing press, manuals of love and marriage would spread far beyond noble courts, reaching towns, villages, and households across Europe. In the next chapter, we step gently into this revolution, where private knowledge became public, and manuals of love became books for the many. When the hum of lutes and the whispers of chivalric codes began to fade, another sound arose across Europe, the steady rhythm of presses at work. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century transformed nearly every part of human knowledge, and manuals of love and marriage were no exception. For centuries, such writings had existed only in manuscripts, copied slowly by hand, accessible mainly to nobles, clergy, or scholars. But with the press, these guides entered a wider world. Suddenly, words of intimacy, duty, and affection could travel far beyond courts and monasteries, reaching the homes of merchants, farmers, and townsfolk. The spread of these manuals reflected the broader spirit of the time. The Renaissance was an age of rediscovery and curiosity. People sought guidance not only in science and philosophy, but also in the tender matters of the heart. Manuals of marriage now became part of this thirst for instruction. One of the most popular themes was the ideal household. Books offered advice on choosing a spouse, managing finances, raising children, and maintaining harmony. They blended practical knowledge with moral teaching, reminding readers that love was both a blessing and a responsibility. Some manuals leaned heavily on religious authority, drawing from biblical teachings to structure the roles of husband and wife. Others took a more secular tone, presenting marriage as a social partnership essential for stability. The balance between affection and duty remained central, but the audience had widened. No longer just nobles, but artisans, traders, and laborers could read these guides. For the first time, literacy itself became linked with love. Reading together, or exchanging books of advice, became a form of shared intimacy. Manuals encouraged couples not only to live rightly, but to understand one another through words. The language of these manuals was often plain and instructional. Unlike the ornate poetry of troubadours, the printed texts favored clarity. They spoke directly: a husband must provide, a wife must honor, children must be guided. Yet within this structure, hints of tenderness emerged. Manuals encouraged kindness, patience, and respect, qualities that softened the harder edges of duty. In towns and villages, these books became household companions. They sat beside religious texts, consulted in times of doubt or quarrel. Their very presence gave love and marriage a sense of gravity, as if these bonds were not only personal choices but matters worthy of study and reflection. But printing also allowed for diversity of voices. Alongside sober guides, there were playful works, collections of love poems, witty dialogues between imaginary couples, even satirical advice poking fun at the trials of matrimony. The press democratized not only instruction, but humor. Love could be treated seriously, but also lightly, reminding readers that affection carried joy as well as responsibility. With books in circulation, courtship itself began to shift. Manuals offered advice on letters, how to compose declarations of love, how to respond with modesty, how to balance sincerity with caution. These guides shaped the growing culture of written romance, where paper carried what lips could not speak aloud. Yet, like earlier manuscripts, printed manuals also carried warnings. They spoke of false suitors, of fleeting desires, of the dangers of marrying too hastily. They advised patience, discernment, and alignment of values. The written page thus became a guardian, guiding hearts away from folly as much as towards affection. The accessibility of these works created a new rhythm in relationships. Couples could read together, parents could offer manuals as gifts, and communities could debate what good marriage truly meant. In this way, the printing press wove private intimacy into the fabric of public culture. The act of buying, gifting, or reading a marriage manual became a quiet ritual in itself, a sign of care, a gesture of preparation for shared life. Some of these manuals were richly illustrated. Woodcuts showed scenes of domestic harmony, families gathered around hearths, couples walking through gardens, mothers cradling infants. These images reinforced ideals of balance, love, and order. For readers who could not grasp every word, the illustrations spoke clearly of what was valued. Of course, not all manuals carried the same weight. Some were deeply moral, intended to preserve tradition. Others were quietly daring, questioning strict hierarchies and hinting at greater equality between partners. While subtle, these shifts planted seeds for later debates about love, freedom, and choice. The printing press made it harder to suppress ideas. Even as authorities attempted to regulate texts, manuscripts on love continued to slip through, carried by merchants, hidden among other works, whispered about in taverns and markets. Love was no longer confined to courtly rituals, it had become something shared, debated, and shaped by common people. In this expansion, manuals became less like sacred codes and more like companions. They no longer dictated ideals from above, but offered suggestions, stories, and reflections. A couple might follow them strictly, or they might smile and set the book aside. Either way, the act of reading had brought them closer, if only for a moment. As we close this segment, we can hear the quiet hum of presses, the scent of ink, the rustle of fresh pages bound with twine. Manuals of love and marriage, once whispered in noble courts, were now part of everyday life. They guided, warned, inspired, and amused. They were no longer secrets of the few, but treasures of the many. From the spread of the press, we moved gently toward a quieter path, the manuals that did not fit the mold, the ones that whispered ideas too bold for their time. These rare guides, often hidden or destroyed, reveal the restless human spirit pushing against tradition. Our next chapter leads us into these shadows, the forgotten pages that dared to imagine love differently. Not every manual of love and marriage was content to repeat tradition. Some spoke in softer, more daring tones, suggesting that affection could carry equality, that intimacy might belong to both partners, or that bonds of love did not always need to follow the rigid rules of family and church. These works were fragile. Many were banned, suppressed, or hidden away. Some were mocked, while others were quietly copied, their ideas passed from hand to hand. They remind us that history, though shaped by authority, has always contained quiet voices of resistance. One category of these texts dealt with equality in marriage. At a time when wives were often treated as subordinates, a handful of manuals suggested that love could be a partnership of mutual respect. They advised husbands to listen as well as command, to treat wives with patience, and to recognize their shared burdens. Such words may seem simple today, but in the 16th or 17th century, they could be quietly revolutionary. Others explored the language of pleasure and desire. Manuals disguised as medical treatises described how intimacy should be approached for the satisfaction of both partners, not only for procreation. These guides were sometimes condemned as indecent, yet they carried with them the radical suggestion that women's desires were not to be ignored. Such texts often wrapped themselves in scholarly tone, claiming authority through science or philosophy, while quietly offering guidance meant to bring tenderness into shared life. There were also works that explored unconventional unions. Some whispered about love outside marriage, others described same-sex affections in allegory, cloaked in metaphor to escape censorship. A few even speculated on celibate partnerships built on friendship rather than physical intimacy. These writings rarely survived intact. They were too easily judged as dangerous or heretical. Yet fragments remain, hints that not everyone accepted the boundaries imposed upon love. One of the most intriguing elements of these manuals was their tendency to blur categories, to mix humor with instruction, to blend poetry with practical advice, to disguise radical ideas beneath layers of allegory. Some might appear as simple jest books, filled with jokes about marriage, but beneath the humor, they planted seeds of doubt about rigid gender roles or excessive authority. In this way, laughter became a shield, allowing dangerous truths to hide in plain sight. Censorship was ever present. Authorities watched closely for works that strayed too far from doctrine. Yet the printing press made absolute control impossible. Ideas spread like whispers in a marketplace, carried across borders, tucked inside bundles of cloth or grain. Even suppressed manuals found readers, if only briefly. The forbidden quality of these texts gave them a special allure. To read them was to step into a secret space, where the rules of society seemed less solid, and the possibilities of love more fluid. The most daring manuals suggested that love itself was a force beyond law, that it could not be contained by rules, nor silenced by authority. They described affection as a natural power, a binding energy, something written into the heart more firmly than into any book. In their quiet way, they gave dignity to desire, even when it was condemned. While many of these works were destroyed, their influence lingered. Later philosophers, poets, and reformers echoed themes first whispered in these forbidden pages. The idea of love as partnership, of intimacy as mutual, of marriage as chosen rather than imposed, all these notions carry traces of those hidden manuals. It is soothing to reflect on how fragile texts can carry such lasting power. A single manual, read in secret by a handful of people, could shape ideas passed down for generations. Even burned pages leave an imprint, as if the act of suppression itself ensures remembrance. These forgotten manuals remind us that love has always resisted neat boundaries. It slips past authority, finds cracks in tradition, and insists on being lived in countless forms. The past was not only duty and silence. It was also curiosity, tenderness, and rebellion. For us today, these fragments are calming not because they are scandalous, but because they show continuity. The same questions asked centuries ago, about equality, intimacy, choice, remain with us. To know that others wrestled with them long before us is a gentle reminder that we are not alone in our seeking, and so, we close this chapter with an image, a reader in a quiet chamber, holding a fragile, forbidden book. Listening to words that may never be spoken aloud again. Manuals that challenged norms have largely disappeared, yet their echoes remain, like faint music carried across time. From these hidden pages, we now step softly into our final chapter. Having journeyed from ancient clay to forbidden fragments, we pause to reflect on what remains with us today. The manuals of love and marriage, though often forgotten, still whisper in modern advice, traditions, and expectations, our final segment will bring us into the present, drawing threads between past and present, and offering a gentle closing to this journey. Imagine, for a moment, a quiet evening in the modern world. The glow of a screen replaces candlelight. Words flow not from quills or presses, but from fingertips moving across glass. Advice about love fills every corner: digital articles, podcasts, self-help books, even the brief murmur of a social post, and yet, beneath all this noise, something familiar breathes. The essence of the old manuals, those early whispers of guidance, longing, and caution, still lingers. The ancient clay tablets spoke of duty. Medieval manuscripts wove longing into ritual. Renaissance books balanced faith with affection. And the hidden manuals dared to speak of equality and pleasure. All these layers, built across time, now shape the invisible architecture of how we still think about love and marriage. Even today, when we hear advice like "listen to your partner," or "communication is key," we echo the old scribes who urged mutual respect and patience. When we speak of love as something that requires effort and intention, we repeat, unknowingly, the calm voices of those long-forgotten teachers. But something else has changed. The manuals of the past often carried certainty. They spoke in commandments, not questions. Modern voices, in contrast, are softer, more open to doubt. We now understand that love is not a single truth, but a collection of shifting experiences, shaped by culture, circumstance, and time, and yet, that desire for structure, for guidance, remains deeply human. Whether we seek wisdom from medieval monks or modern psychologists, we are still asking the same question: how do two people learn to share their lives? Some contemporary works still borrow from the past directly. Advice columns invoke the rules of chivalry when speaking of respect. Relationship coaches reference ancient philosophies when teaching communication. Even the notion of soulmates, so common today, has echoes in medieval mysticism, where lovers were described as two halves of one divine whole. The modern world may have shed the parchment and ink, but not the longing for order in love's chaos. It is curious to think how many of our new ideas are ancient ones in disguise. The emphasis on consent, equality, and mutual pleasure, once dangerous ideas, are now accepted as cornerstones of healthy relationships. Those forbidden pages of segment 9, quietly burned or hidden, have become part of everyday discourse. The manuals that were once silenced now speak through us, and yet, not everything has been gained. The calmness, the ritual, the patience once found in old guidance have often been replaced by immediacy. Love is faster now, messages sent in seconds, connections formed in a glance. The waiting, the writing, the slow unfolding of emotion that filled so many ancient pages is now rare, but perhaps that is why these old manuals still hold quiet beauty. They remind us to slow down, to read the heart as patiently as one reads an old book, carefully, without rushing to the end. In their own way, modern relationships have created new manuals, not written by monks or philosophers, but by individuals sharing their stories. Online threads, diaries, letters, and advice channels are the descendants of the scrolls and codices of the past. Each one, whether humble or profound, continues the same human endeavor, to understand love, and though technology has changed the form, the rhythm remains familiar. The gentle voice offering reassurance. The patient tone that says, "It's all right to not know." Perhaps, if those ancient writers could look upon us now, they would recognize more than we think. The same hopes, the same worries, the same quiet yearning to do right by another person. Even our mistakes would be familiar to them. Across centuries, love remains the most studied, most misunderstood art, endlessly rewritten, never perfected. In this reflection, there is peace. To know that we are part of a continuous story, that every gesture of care, every note of affection, every shared silence links us to countless others. Manuals may fade, books may burn, but the impulse to love wisely remains, persistent and calm. The forgotten manuals have not truly vanished. They live quietly in our words, our customs, and our small acts of tenderness. And so, as we bring this long journey to rest, imagine yourself closing an ancient book, its leather soft from centuries of touch. Dust swirls gently in the light. The air feels still, as though listening. You trace your fingers along the faded ink and realize, it has always been about the same longing, to understand how two souls can meet, remain, and grow. That search has never ended. It has only changed its language, and now, we close the final page. The forgotten manuals of love and marriage may have changed in form, but their spirit endures, in our questions, our tenderness, and our quiet efforts to understand one another. May their echoes remind us to love not only passionately, but patiently, to study one another not as puzzles to be solved, but as stories to be read, slowly, carefully, and with reverence. Another whisper from the past, now fading into the night. Thanks for listening. Subscribe for more sleepy stories from history. And until next time,